Before we can fully appreciate and understand why 13 of England's North American colonies revolted and declared their own independence in 1776, we must first understand how the colonies developed systems of self government and came to expect a greater amount of individual liberty than they had traditionally been given in the British realm. In this section, we will identify how freedom of the press evolved in the colonies, citing an important colonial court case pertaining to this issue. Then we will identify the basic structures of colonial government, assessing how this model would create unprecedented levels of self-government and also create friction between the interests of the colonists and the interest of the crown. Books in the 18th century were few and far between. The process of printing and binding books, not to mention the tight regulation the Crown placed on publications, made bound books prohibitively expensive for the average American farmer. A modest household likely had only one book, if any at all, and it would have been the Bible, which often substituted as a classroom text for children being taught how to read. There were a few incredibly wealthy Americans that could afford their own libraries, like the Byrds, who had one of the first libraries in America with over 4,000 books. Some cities had created private libraries. The first to do so was Philadelphia, under the support and recommendation of Benjamin Franklin. But opportunities to read were all in all rare. By the time the American Revolution came around, there were only 50 public libraries in the whole United States. As an alternative to expensive books, frugal Americans patronized printers that cranked out pamphlets, leaflets, and journals on hand-operated printing presses. These became the precursors to a thriving newsprint industry in the colonies. The first newspaper with a continuous publication debuted in Boston in 1704. Papers like the Boston Newsletter were published weekly, but the pace of news traveled slowly, so events that were covered in the paper were often several weeks old. To supplement the news, editorials and opinion pieces were published as well. Newspapers became a powerful agency for airing colonial grievances and rallying opposition to government action. Compared to their counterparts in England, Americans exercised a tremendous amount of latitude when it came to free speech and criticizing their government. Freedom of speech was only limited to the members of British Parliament, and the freedom of the press was virtually unknown in Europe. The English criminal common law of seditious libel made criticizing government a crime. British Lord Chief Justice John Holt, writing in 1704 and 1705, explained the rationale for the prohibition. Quote, "For it is very necessary for all governments that the people should have a good opinion of it." End quote. The objective truth of a statement in violation of libel laws was not considered a valid defense in England. But in British North America, the colonists viewed the press as a tool that could be used to keep their crown-appointed governors in check. Though freedom of the press would not officially be established as a right in North America until after the American Revolution, the famous Zenninger trial of 1734 and 35 entrenched this tradition and emboldened colonists to use newspapers to speak out against royal government when they felt abused. In this particular court case, a printer by the name of Peter Zenninger was sued by the government of New York for seditious libel, or criticizing the governor in such a way that was so damaging to the governor's reputation that it could be seen as an attempt to overthrow the government itself. Zenninger's attorney, Andrew Hamilton, admitted that Zenninger had criticized the government, but argued that his statements were true, and therefore he shouldn't be considered libelous. His premise was that a free press was a liberty designed to expose and protect the people from a corrupt government that bent on domination. Despite the judge's warning to the jurors to come back with a guilty verdict, The jury was so moved by the closing arguments of Hamilton that they returned a verdict of not guilty. In time, this court decision established a doctrine that true statements about public officials could not be prosecuted as libel. Newspapers were thus eventually free to print responsible criticisms of powerful officials. There were three kinds of colonial governments or governors during the 18th century. By 1775, 8 colonies had royal governors. These governors would have been appointed directly by the king or the king's council in England. 3 colonies had governors selected by proprietors or investors into the colony. This would be the case with the Quaker proprietors of Pennsylvania, as well as the Catholic proprietors of Maryland and the Puritan proprietors of Delaware. Connecticut and Rhode Island stood alone in electing their own governors under the self-governing charters. A visual example of this is the king in a royal colony would appoint the head of the executive branch or the royal governor. This individual would have the power to veto any legislation that was passed by the colonial assembly or legislative branch. With the assistance of the royal governor, the crown would also appoint members to the judicial branch. So in a respect, 2 of the 3 branches of government were decided and influenced by the king. Each colony had a legislative body as well. The legislative body was divided into 2 houses or was a bicameral legislature. Before a law could pass, it had to go through and be approved by each chamber or each level of the government. The upper house was a group of lawmakers that was appointed by the crown in the 8 royal colonies and by the proprietors in the 3 proprietary colonies. In the 2 self-governing colonies, the people that made up the upper house were chosen by the voters directly. On the lower house, or in the chamber that was most directly representative of the people's wishes, the lower house was elected by the people. And by the people, I mean white male property owners. In some colonies, the backcountry or more rural Western territories were seriously underrepresented in the legislative assemblies. This would develop a resentment towards colonial elites and again, create class conflict in the colonies. So to continue with our visual model here, we can, just as a reminder, remember that the executive branch was appointed by the crown. The judicial branch was appointed by the crown as well, either directly or indirectly. In the royal colonies, the upper house, or 1/2 of the legislative assembly, was appointed by the crown, which means the other half was appointed directly by white male voters. Even though that sounds incredibly limited by today's standards, this was revolutionary in the 18th century because the American colonies, unlike any other British colonies, were given a chance for self-government. Through this process of self-government, the colonists became accustomed to taxing themselves. This was a privilege. Other colonies, as I said, for example, the British colonies in India, the British colonies in the West Indies, the British colonies in Ireland, none of these places allowed for self-representation and self-taxation. But since America was such a distance and had been established with charters that guaranteed the rights of Englishmen, the American colonies were given an opportunity for self-government. Additionally, as we talked about before, the policy of salutary neglect. London generally left the colonial governors to fend for themselves and didn't interfere with colonial policy making very directly. This made the relationship between the legislative assemblies and the crown-appointed governor a bit contentious. Colonial assemblies quickly learned that they could hold the governor's pay ransom, that they could refuse to pay the governor if the governor did not abide by what it was the legislative assemblies wanted to do. And so there are examples of governors who served for a decade or more and were never paid for their job and ended up going to the grave close to broke because they weren't ever paid for their job because they couldn't get along with the legislative assemblies. Now, eventually, the Crown tried to fix this problem. We've already mentioned the Townshend Acts, and one of the things we're going to look at as far as a buildup to the American Revolution with the Townshend Acts was that the Crown was trying to fix this issue and find a way to fund and pay colonial governors for their work. This would take that power away from the colonists and further inflame their anger towards the monarchy. Now, division of power amongst the colonies varied depending on the region. In the South, where people were more spread out, where the population density wasn't as high, the establishment of county-level governments remained the standard. In more urban, densely populated New England, town meetings, city meetings, the real focus of control was town by town. In the middle colonies, again, the middle colonies bridging both customs of the South and New England, both county level and city level government was the standard. All in all, these meetings were laboratories for democracy. Despite the fact that the colonies were laboratories for democracies, the colonies were not by any means uncontrolled democracy. The ballot was by no means a birthright. Typically, it was reserved for the wealthy property class, and those people would use their power to prevent or greatly limit the influence of those without power. The fear was that if you didn't have property, what kind of investment in society did you have? And so the sense that the government should be run by those that own the country was pretty much standard. Until 1775, religious and property requirements were pretty common. Okay, that meant that about half of all adult white males and all women and all people of color were prohibited from voting. Not only that, but of those people that were eligible, many of them did not vote. So deference to the ruling class meant that many people who probably were eligible to vote decided not to. All in all, America was not a true democracy socially, economically, or politically by the time of the American Revolution. But it was more democratic than any place else on earth. The democratic seeds, this idea of self-governance, self-taxation, the expansion of liberty, and the participation of the citizenry to protect those rights were planted in the 18th century.